Now, tonight's speaker, Arthur Eckstein, is a professor of history and distinguished scholar/teacher at the University of Maryland. Now, his training is in the ancient Mediterranean, and so he'll be reviewing some ancient Mediterranean texts tonight in the original. Is that what it is? Okay, but no. The amazing thing is that Art is a Renaissance person, because normally someone who specializes in ancient history and studies the language and does all of these other things are pretty much focused on their topic. But he isn't just focused on that topic, because he's also written about contemporary things. And for example, he's the co-editor of a collection of essays on the director, John Ford. And as a matter of fact, John Ford's film, The Searchers, is his favorite film of all time. Now, you don't usually find people who are trained in that area talk and write about things of this sort. But in addition, he also has written a book on the famous violent left wing of the American anti-war group in the 60s and 70s. He's written a book called The Weather Underground and the FBI, 1969 to 1973. Now, I suppose some of you have heard about the Weather Underground. As with all things in 1968, I learned about it from my parents, but they said it was a very exciting era, and I wish I had been there. But in any case, tonight, when you ask a question, ask it in a big voice, and then we'll ask Art to repeat the question. All right? And is it October or whatever it is? I think I have that date now, but nonetheless, please join us in welcoming Dr. Art Eckstein to Camden County College.
Thanks a lot, Jack. What I'm going to do is give you a little background on the Weather Underground, and then I'm going to tell you how I got involved in writing about them purely by luck. And then I'm going to tell you what I found in 30,000 pages of FBI files, which had previously not been released, and reveal a very interesting story that people don't know. The Weather Underground was in many ways born out of 1968. It was born out of the failure of the anti-war movement to produce a candidate for president, and instead of feeling among the anti-war people, especially Students for a Democratic Society, that the results of 1968 elections had shut them out completely, and that there was no hope in the traditional American political system. By 1969, they were thinking very seriously about guerrilla warfare in order to change the government. And the Weather Underground organization was the most notorious American radical group committed to political violence in the late 60s and early 70s. In retrospect, it's odd that the FBI elevated a band of about 100 young college students into a leading place in the Bureau's most wanted list. 7 out of the 10 people on the most wanted list that were in every post office were Weather Underground leaders. The FBI decision to do this garnered Weather a huge amount of publicity and made some of the leaders famous. Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dohrn are most famous. Starting in the summer of 1970, FBI wanted posters featuring images of Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dohrn, and others were hung prominently in post offices all around the United States, and this continued for years and years. Yet, the Weather Underground organization itself was minuscule. To be sure, it was almost unique among radicals in the period in using dynamite bombs to protest government policies, and as well as the practices of some corporations as opposed to the less dangerous but far more numerous Molotov cocktail bombs, fire bombs, the use of which was very common in 1969 and 70. Hundreds of these were set off in the country. I don't know whether you guys might remember that, but I mean, people who think we're in bad shape now don't remember what was going, or don't know just how bad things were in 69 and 70. In San Francisco alone, there were 62 bombings in 1969. But weather was different, not using fire bombs, gasoline bombs, although they did a little of that, but real dynamite bombs, very dangerous stuff. On the other hand, the weather organization set off only a total of about 25 bombs during the 7 years that it was in existence. All of these bombs were relatively small. Fully half of them occurred in 1970. So then we're looking at from 71 to 77, a total of 12 bombs, one every 6 months. So that means that after 1970, weather was setting off one bomb every 6 months, mostly in bathrooms of government buildings and corporate headquarters. Yet, for years, the FBI leadership remained obsessed with capturing weathermen, and they remained prominent on the FBI's most wanted list. Why? After all, by any rational measure, weatherman was not an existential threat to the United States. It wasn't a threat to the general citizenry. As I'll explain, they intentionally never killed anybody, nor were they a threat really to the government. It's true that weather was the only white group committed to revolutionary violence that operated on a national scale. They were a nationwide organization. It's also true, and very important, that some of the operations were shockingly spectacular. The bombing of the Capitol itself in March 1971. The bombing of the Pentagon in May 1972. The bombing of the State Department in January 1975. These targets were chosen for maximum impact, maximum TV coverage, and they certainly got it. The weather people then and now are experts at PR. And it's also true to say that the weather people were determined revolutionaries. They weren't kids out for a lark. They constantly proclaimed their desire to overthrow and humiliate the government that the FBI stood to defend. They had a Marxist-Leninist theory of what they were doing. You wouldn't want to read a lot of their literature. It's turgid Marxist-Leninist stuff. But moreover, when in the summer of 1970, the original decision was made in Washington to put weathermen up on the most wanted posters, the FBI believed there were as many as 1,000 weatherman guerrillas with 5,000 helpers located around the country. That was the conclusion they had come to, that was the size of weathermen. They were off by a factor of 10. They exaggerated by a factor of 10. There's only 100 weather underground guerrillas and maybe 200 helpers. But having come up with that figure, they then went into a panic and came to the conclusion that the country was under desperate threat from these people. And by the fall of 1970, the FBI had drawn up a list of 11,000 radicals who were going to be incarcerated in concentration camps if President Nixon declared a national emergency. How different the politics of the United States would be if that had happened. But luckily, it didn't. If you then ask, okay, they panicked in 1970 and 71. By 1972, they certainly understood that weatherman was a tiny group and not really very effective. Why did they keep after it? And the fact is they did keep after them. And this was an obsession of what was called seat of government, that is the FBI headquarters in Washington. FBI special agents in charge around the country, on the other hand, resisted the orders to go after weather that was coming from Washington. And that was because of a very simple reason. FBI special agents in charge only got promoted on the basis of arrests and convictions. They never caught any weather people. It was a dry hole, and the committing of resources to trying to find them instead of fighting crime was endangering to the careers of the special agents in charge. I know you want to think of the FBI as a smoothly running organization. It was not. People on the ground resisted. They resisted by sending memos to Washington saying, we can't commit resources to this. It's very labor intensive. We're not going to catch anybody. And meanwhile, there's a huge increase in crime that was going on at the same time in the country, and they wanted to fight that. Well, it's one thing to send a memo, but the other thing that happened was the FBI special agents in charge around the country simply resisted the order. They didn't commit people to it. They didn't commit people to the weather hunt. They just didn't tell Washington that they hadn't committed them. So on the FBI side then, if you think about it, this story would really be a comedy if it wasn't for the fact that some people got killed. And I'll talk about that. That is, Weatherman was not a very effective revolutionary group. The FBI was totally ineffective in catching them. And the real thing that happened, the most important thing that happened was the FBI, in its desperation to catch somebody, began to engage in illegal burglaries of friends and relatives of known weather members. These burglaries were totally illegal and unconstitutional. You can't get a burglary, a government burglary supposedly, without a court order. And they could never get court orders against the grandma of X or the uncle of Y because the grandma and the uncle hadn't committed any crimes. So in the desperation to find information, the FBI engaged in dozens and dozens of illegal burglaries. My wife is actually the champion of illegal burglaries. Her little house in the Catskills was burgled by the FBI without search warrant 6 times in 1 year. In addition, her phone was tapped and they planted a bug. She never committed any crime. She's a Canadian. She was afraid of committing any crime. They don't commit crimes anyway. Her FBI file is 1,300 pages long. And when we went and talked at the National Archives with the head of the Freedom of Information Act people there, and she said, well, my FBI file is 1,300 pages long, he said to her, is that what you think? Yeah. So an enormous amount of effort was spent. An enormous amount of effort from fighting real crime was diverted by the FBI to find these people, and they failed to do it. In the process, they themselves committed violations of the Constitution. And we're not talking about, we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, but we're not talking about extensions of the Fourth Amendment. We're talking about the actual Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment forbids the government to engage in breaking into people's houses to inspect people's papers and effects without a court order. The FBI did this hundreds of times between 1970 and 75. It could have happened that several hundred FBI agents could have ended up in court. In fact, the only trials that ever occurred in relationship, only federal trials that ever occurred in relationship to Weatherman were the trials of Mark Felt and Ed Miller, high government officials who were charged in federal court in the fall of 1980 with violating the civil rights of the parents and friends of people in the Weather Underground. And they were convicted by the jury. They were pardoned immediately by President Reagan. One can say about this that reading the FBI files on this was eye-opening. That the story is one in which you have a tiny group being pursued by people who actually can't catch them. And in the end, in their desperation, because of the propaganda that they had created by saying that these people were a real threat, were desperate to find them, and therefore engaged in overreaction and violation of the law themselves. I'll just say the actual story has a happy ending. I'll just tell you right off the bat. I'm not going to pull punches on this. In 1973, the FBI was asked by a federal judge who was going to try on federal bombing charges any weather people who were caught. And these were serious charges carrying penalties of like 75 years in prison. And the federal judge, Damon Pierce, says to the FBI leadership, is any of the evidence that you have collected against these people, was any of it collected illegally? And the FBI wrote back a memo saying, no. Then Watergate broke wide open. And in the late fall of 1973, the FBI informed the judge, we're dropping all bombing cases against the weathermen. We're dismissing the cases. What that meant was, when the weather people got tired of being underground, they just surfaced. There were no charges against them, and they went on with their regular middle-class lives. It's an amazing story of a fat, rich, compassionate country letting people go. And actually, on both sides, both on the FBI side and on the weatherman side. Okay, so that's just a general introduction to these people and to the story. How did I get involved in it? I think that Jack is still stunned that I was involved in it. What happened was, out of the blue, in December 2012, I got an email from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, from the head of it, saying, why don't you give a paper on the conflict between the New Left and the Counterculture on campuses in the late 60s? Because I know you were a hippie, and I think this would be fun. And I said, cool, oh, okay, that sounds like fun. I would do that. So I started reading about stuff, but the National Archives are on the University of Maryland campus. And a colleague of mine who was somebody who used the archives, we call these people nicely archive rats. My archive rat friend said, you know, you really ought to go and see what's in the archives. And I said, okay, which meant no. And he went himself, and you have no finer colleague than this. He went himself and asked if they had stuff, and then he called me up and says, now you really have to go. And I say, why? Because the FBI just released 30,000 pages of memos concerning the Weather Underground that nobody has seen. And I said, oh, okay. So I spent 2 years going to the archives and reading stuff, reading memos, and I'm going to hand out copies of what an FBI memo looks like, so people can see what they look like. This is a very important memo, actually, but just take a look at this. You'll notice that the last page is blacked out. That's for national security reasons. I have no idea what's on that page. So I started working on this, and I eventually wrote a book, which I'm flacking, Bad Moon Rising, How the Weather Underground Beat the FBI and Lost the Revolution. So what did I discover in the archives? I have to say that for an ancient historian for whom every tiny piece of evidence is precious, it was simply stunning when the archivists at the National Archives brought out 2 hand trucks of files, thousands and thousands of files, And they were kind enough to say, we know that's a lot, so we have drawn up a table of contents for you, so you can know what to look for. I mean, they're really great people. It's an amazing thing to work with them. So what did I find in the archives? Probably the single most amazing thing, which is actually in the memo that I'm sending around on page 4 of that memo. The memo is all concerned with fighting SDS and radical left, is this. In the spring of 1969, the FBI had about 100 civilian informants in the radical group, Students for a Democratic Society, which then numbered maybe 60,000 members. In that period, SDS was divided between a group called the Progressive Workers' Party. These were standard Marxist-Leninists who believed that the working class was the only lever of revolution and that what you had to do was educate the working class, propagandize the working class to understand that they should rebel. The second group, which was I'm going to call Weatherman, it was still not quite formed, did not believe that the white working class could ever lead a revolution. And that was for 2 reasons. One, they were too prosperous. Yes, these were crumbs from the capitalists' table, but nevertheless, people were pretty satisfied. But even more important, the weather thinkers, theorists said, the white working class is racist. They are never going to engage in a revolution that will help the black people become equal. It was a very pessimistic view of the white working class, and that certainly has relevance to a current political situation, that they would say that. And then the question became, who was then going to lead the revolution? It could not be the students themselves. There weren't enough of them. And they weren't economically powerful. They were still dependent on their parents. Let me just say about this that the Weatherman group consisted of people mostly in their early 20s, 20, 21, 22. The leaders were maybe 25. Very, very young people. But that was the conclusion they had come to. And they formed their own anti-progressive labor party, and the name that they took for it was Weatherman, from a Bob Dylan song, because they were very affected by the counterculture. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, from Subterranean Homesick Blues. In Europe, when I talk about this, people say to me, what kind of a name is that for a revolutionary group? Shouldn't it be the National Liberation Front of Berkeley or something like that? Why Weatherman? And I said, because they were deeply influenced by the counterculture. They're deeply influenced by Bob Dylan, and by rock music, and by smoking dope. And it was precisely because of this that the FBI told its civilian informants in 1969, we want you to back Weatherman in the conference that's going to be held on what direction SDS should go. The largest student organization in the country, the largest left-wing organization in the country. We're throwing our weight behind Weatherman rather than progressive labor. And that's what happened. On the second day of this conference, which was a bizarre conference, it was at this conference that Black Panthers, who were invited in to speak by Weatherman, informed people that as far as gender was concerned, they believed that the proper position of women in the movement was prone. That led to a riot in the hall, and they were forced off the stage. Nevertheless, on the second day, Bernardine Dorn, who was the leader of Weather, led a walkout from this meeting to create the true SDS. And of 1,200 or so delegates, 700 followed her out. In that group of 700 was dozens and dozens of FBI informants. And the memo that I'm sending you around, if you look on page 4, boasts that they did this, that the FBI, insofar it was in their power, split SDS in half. And this is what was called a COINTELPRO operation. Have people heard that term, COINTELPRO? Counterintelligence. And that this was one of the most successful of all COINTELPRO operations, not known until 2016, when I released the book about it. And it's an ironic thing. And why did the FBI support Weatherman? Because they thought they were a bunch of disorganized hippies. They underestimated what Weatherman was capable of, just as a year later, they overestimated what Weather was capable of by a factor of 10. So this is the first thing to say, probably the most important thing to say. And believe me, when I talked to some Weather people, and I should say, after about 2 years of looking at documents, I started talking to Weather people. They were pretty approachable. They're all grandparents now. They're all calmed down. They're all on the left. There's nobody on the right. But they weren't hard to find, and they were anxious to talk, and they were quite self-critical of their younger selves, which was interesting. A few were not. A few were very rigid. But the people I got to know best, including the person who was the chief bomber, the person who bombed the Pentagon and bombed the Capitol and bombed the State Department, he was the most genial person you could ever meet. They were, in fact, ordinary people. If you saw them on the street, you wouldn't think twice. And the chief bomber even more, just a nebbishy little guy. You just wouldn't think about it. And I asked him, Ron Fliegelman. And when I asked him why he was the bomber, he laughed and said, I was surrounded by intellectuals who didn't know how to fit a car key into the car ignition to get it started. I was the only person who was good with his hands, so I ended up doing it. Okay. By the summer of 1969, Weatherman had seized SDS headquarters, had seized SDS money, had seized the high-tech printing press, which had been donated to SDS by Abby Rockefeller, and they were in charge of the mass organization, except they really didn't want to be. Their view was a Leninist view, better, fewer, but better. They didn't want a mass organization. They wanted an organization of dedicated revolutionaries who would follow orders, who would be hard on themselves and hard on others. They went, I have to say about this, from one failure to the next with this idea. In October 1969, they organized what was called the Days of Rage in Chicago, which was going to be a replay of the Chicago Democratic Party demonstrations, only with them now wearing helmets against the cops who had beaten them up and attacking the cops. The leadership expected 25,000 people to show up. In reality, only 400 did. They nevertheless declared this a victory because they had fought the cops. And people want to see this. I have a sort of color photograph of the Days of Rage. Here's Bill Ayers, and he's talking to Terry Robbins, who blew himself up in the townhouse, which we're going to talk about in a minute. What was their plan? They believed that they could cause a revolution by causing the police to act in an even more aggressive and brutal way in the ghetto. And so their plan was to assassinate police who were associated with oppression in the ghetto, and the result of that would be increased police brutality in the ghetto, leading to an explosion like it happened in 1967 in Newark or in Detroit. That's what they thought they were going to do. And that meant they were going to kill people. And so the second thing I found is that for about 90 days, between December 69 and March of 1970, they were planning on lethal operations, intentionally planning to kill people, not ordinary people, they were going to kill cops. Basically, they were going to kill cops. And that doing that would show the oppressed that the police were not all powerful, and would show that you could win against them. On March 6, 1970, Weatherman planned to kick off the revolution with a triple event: a bombing in Fort Dix, New Jersey, of an enlisted man's dance, and 2 bombs in Detroit connected to the Detroit Police Department and the Algiers Motel incident, the terrible murders of black people in the insurrection in Detroit in 1967. In some ways, God watches over the United States. In Detroit, there was the final and only civilian informant left in SDS Weatherman. The others had been driven out by various ways. That guy, Larry Grathwall, told the FBI where the bombs were. One bomb had 10 sticks of dynamite, and it would have blown up not just the building on one side, but also a popular restaurant in the ghetto on the other. The other was a bomb of 30 sticks of dynamite that was aiming at police precinct headquarters, the cops who had caused so much devastation in the Detroit riot in 1967. If that bomb had gone off, the entire building would have been demolished. How many people would have been killed? 50, 60, something like that, in a blow on one day by American terrorists. That's what would have happened. But the cops had their informant who told the FBI and the police where the bombs were, and the bombs were discovered and defused. In the case of this first bomb, the 10-stick dynamite bomb, within 30 seconds of it going off. How did the bombs get into the police headquarters? There was no security. In those days, there wasn't security. These folks walked in. There's an old sergeant at the desk. They say, "Oh, we're looking for our lost bicycle." He says, "Okay, go down the hall," and they find where they're going to drop the bomb, and they put it in. Then they left. So that was really a very striking thing. What happened in New York, however, was a tragedy, not a farce. Building the dynamite bombs, 3 of the most important weather leaders made a mistake and blew themselves up. They blew themselves up, and they blew up the house that they were staying in. This sent shockwaves through the weather leadership. And a couple of months later, in May 1970, they had a meeting out in Mendocino, California, in a very beautiful setting. And at that meeting, they came to the conclusion that they were not going to kill anybody. They're one of the few terrorist groups in history that reversed itself on murder. And one can ask, well, why did that happen? Certainly part of it was the realization that people really died, that this wasn't a movie, that people actually got killed. That certainly had an impact on people. The second, Bernardine Dorn and Jeff Jones had been deeply affected by the counterculture personally. Jeff Jones, who was a leader, came from a Quaker background, and his father said, "You're going up to meet with your friends, leave your gun." And he did. He left his gun. So some of the leadership were very affected by that. Another aspect of it was that they were not just mindless terrorists, they had a constituency that they were trying to build. And that constituency was partly black and partly politicized hippies like me. And the politicized hippies were writing in their underground newspapers, "Do not kill. We're opposed to violence. We're opposed to murder. What are you doing? Do not kill. If you kill, you will be alone. If you don't kill, we'll support you." And this was true even of the Berkeley Tribe, which was the most radical underground newspaper in the country, that published editorials saying, "Don't do this." And they took that in. In addition, in May 1970, this was the May of Cambodia and Kent State. This was the May in which 4 college students were killed at Kent by the National Guard. You might have thought that would lead them to say, aha, the revolution is beginning. And especially because the result of Kent State was the closing down of hundreds of colleges and universities across the country. They could have said, oh, our social lever is the students after all, not the black people, it's the students. So let's lead the violence. But in fact, they realized that if they wanted to get the students, they could not kill either. So part of it was people were deeply affected personally by the counterculture. Part of it was their constituency was opposed to lethal violence. And that's what I wrote in the book. But then I talked to a weather leader 6 months ago. She took me aside and said, yeah, I read your book. And I said, it's true that a lot of people were influenced by the counterculture. It's true that Bernardine Dorn was. I wasn't. I said, but why did you vote against it? I listened to my mom. These are terrorists who call home. They're only 21 and 22 years old. They're still very close to their parents. And that's the kind of thing that was going on. I know someone who was on the outskirts of Weather, who spent 2 years, his job was arranging phone calls between parents and children. Why would that happen? The parents wanted to know where their kids were. They were all underground. They had disappeared. They had new names. They didn't know what had happened to their kids. And their kids wanted them to know that they were okay. And this was easy to do because in those days there existed public telephone booths. Nobody had cell phones to be traced. So it was possible to arrange this to happen. Yeah.
In 1969, I was working for a fellow.
You were?
I was working for, actually, we were creating
Yeah.
countrywide funding, all right? But one of the 3 principals was a lawyer who was active in defending various peoples. And I remember the bombing of the 3, because he said 3 of my clients just blew themselves up.
Yeah, right.
But his main complaint all along was, my mail always takes 2 weeks to get to me. Seriously, because it takes the FBI that long to go through everything that's on its way to me.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that brings us back to the FBI. The townhouse explosion and even more the fact that it was clearly coordinated with Detroit. And further, it was coordinated with another bombing that was supposed to go off a week later in San Francisco, set by Howie Mochtinger. This bomb was set in the Department of Justice building in San Francisco. And like some weather bombs, it didn't go off. They didn't build it right. So the weather people called the police and said, there's a bomb in the building, but you better get rid of it before it goes off because we screwed it up somehow. We don't know what's going to happen with it, but you better get rid of it. Again, part of what's going on here is that Weather made this decision not to kill. And that is the reason why it survived for 7 years. Because that was the reason that they had supporters. The Berkeley tribe wasn't lying when it said, if you kill, you'll be alone. But if you don't kill, you'll have support. And what that meant was FBI guys would come to somebody's apartment and knock on the door and say, do you know where people are? Do you know whether people are? And the people behind the door would say, get lost. And the FBI would have to go away. That wouldn't have happened if Weatherman had been engaging in violence, in killing. There were people in Weather who were opposed to the policy of non-killing. They lost in the debate that happened at Mendocino. They bided their time, and in 1981, long after Weatherman had ceased to exist, they engaged in a Brinks robbery in Nyack, New York, in which two cops and a guard were killed. Two of those people are still in prison today, 36 years later. And they're never getting out. Judy Clark and David Gilbert. But because the FBI had dropped the charges against them in 1973, this actually turned out to be the worst thing that could have happened to Weather, because it meant that they were not fugitives anymore. And so what you start getting among these people, Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers especially, is there's no reason for us to be underground. A, the revolution isn't going to happen. B, if the revolution isn't going to happen, we're not fugitives anymore. Let's surface the organization and become the left wing of the Democratic Party. And what happened about that was, starting in 1977, these people just gave up. They surfaced under their real names. There were no heavy charges against them. And they went back to school. They went back to law school in some cases. One of them is now a judge. Lots of them are university professors. And they rejoined bourgeois life. Now, I don't think that could have happened if they'd been killers. But because they made the decision not to kill, they still had a bridge back to mainstream life. Where are they now? They are approaching retirement. Two of them, another bomber just retired from being a mathematics teacher in the Brooklyn school system. And she explained to me why she was a mathematics teacher. She said, you know, in politics, you think you're doing one thing and you end up doing another. In math, if you put the formula on the board, you know it's correct, you know what it is. And she found rest away from politics in doing that kind of thing. Finally, the other thing to say about this is the FBI failed to catch any of them. They searched thousands and thousands of man-hours, hundreds and hundreds of special agents, millions and millions of dollars, and they never caught any of them. It's a very striking thing. And you can say, why did that happen? And somebody said to me, you know, if they killed, maybe the FBI on the special agents in charge in various cities would have taken it more seriously. As it was, they devoted man-hours to it, but they just could not catch them. And they never did catch them. They simply surfaced because they were tired of it. As Bill Ayers said, guilty as hell, free as a bird, it's a great country. And the same was true with the FBI agents. They were committing crimes, engaging in burglary without a court order. Hundreds of FBI agents were involved in this. The number is over 500 in one way or another over 7 years. They all could have been indicted, but that didn't happen because of the generosity of the Carter administration, which only indicted the very highest people for violating the Fourth Amendment. So the story is a kind of American story with a happy ending for just about everybody. And one can ask, why is it that Bill Ayers is famous? And I should say Bill Ayers is not liked by most weather people. But he has been the national spokesman, and there's a reason why he was prominent. He was prominent because he was a friend of Barack Obama. When did he become a friend of Barack Obama? In 1998. That is 20 years after he surfaced. At that time, Bill Ayers, the previous year, in 1997, had been named Chicago Citizen of the Year because he was a professor of education at University of Illinois at Chicago. He had brought in $40 million of money from the Annenberg Foundation for use in the black ghetto on the south side of Chicago. So that is how Obama knew Ayers. And that was made a big deal of in the 2008 campaign. The person who started this, I have to tell you, was not somebody on the right. It was Hillary Clinton, the people working for Hillary Clinton. And the reason that happened was Hillary Clinton knew a woman called Carol Biondi, who was married to a billionaire. They live part of the time on Martha's Vineyard. Carol Biondi's last name was Outen. She was the adoring younger sister of one of the people who got blown up in the townhouse. That person, Diana Outen, had been Bill Ayers' girlfriend. The Outen family hates him because they believe he corrupted her into politics. I think that actually is probably not true. What is true is he's been above ground since 1980. He has never visited her grave. So politics can be really personal at that level. And Carol Biondi told Hillary Clinton about Ayers in a very negative way, and people connected with the Hillary Clinton campaign then went after Obama for being a friend of Ayers. He sort of is a friend of Ayers, but he's a friend of respectable Ayers, not terrorist Ayers. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions. This is a very strange story. It's a story with basically a happy ending, a weird ending that you wouldn't think of, and it just shows, again, how compassionate the country is, the system is, not just to the weather people, but to the FBI people who were violating the law looking for them. Okay, thank you.